Someone asked Buddha, "Why is life filled with suffering?" You've probably heard the rumor that life is suffering is Buddhism's first principle, the Buddha's first noble truth. It's a rumor with good credentials, spread by well-respected academics and Dharma teachers alike. But a rumor nonetheless. The truth about the noble truths is far more interesting. The Buddha taught 4 truths, not one, about life. There is suffering, there is a cause for suffering, there is an end of suffering, and there is a path of practice that puts an end to suffering. These truths taken as a whole are far from pessimistic. They're a practical, problem-solving approach, the way a doctor approaches an illness, or a mechanic a faulty engine. You identify a problem and look for its cause. You then put an end to the problem by eliminating the cause. What's special about the Buddha's approach is that the problem he attacks is the whole of human suffering, and the solution he offers is something human beings can do for themselves. Just as a doctor with a surefire cure for measles isn't afraid of measles, the Buddha isn't afraid of any aspect of human suffering. And, having experienced a happiness totally unconditional, he's not afraid to point out the suffering and stress inherent in places where most of us would rather not see it, in the conditioned pleasures we cling to. He teaches us not to deny that suffering and stress, or to run away from it, but to stand still and face up to it, to examine it carefully. That way, by understanding it, we can ferret out its cause and put an end to it, totally. How confident can you get? I wonder why. One possible explanation is that, in coming to Buddhism, we subconsciously expect it to address issues that have a long history in our own culture. By starting out with suffering as his first truth, the Buddha seems to be offering his position on a question with a long history in the West. Is the world basically good or bad? According to Genesis, this was the first question that occurred to God after he had finished his creation. Had he done a good job? He then looked at the world and saw that it was good. Ever since then, people in the West have sided with or against God on his answer, but in doing so, they have affirmed that the question was worth asking to begin with. When Theravada, the only form of Buddhism to take on Christianity when Europe colonized Asia, was looking for ways to head off what it saw as the missionary menace, Buddhists who had received their education from the missionaries assumed that the question was valid and pressed the first noble truth into service as a refutation of the Christian God. Look at how miserable life is, they said, and it's hard to accept God's verdict on his handiwork. This debating strategy may have scored a few points at the time, and it's easy to find Buddhist apologists who, still living in the colonial past, keep trying to score the same points. The real issue, though, is whether the Buddha intended his first noble truth to answer God's question in the first place, and more importantly, whether we're getting the most out of the first noble truth if we see it in that light. It's hard to imagine what you could accomplish by saying that life is suffering. You'd have to spend your time arguing with people who see more than just suffering in life. The Buddha himself says as much in one of his discourses. A Brahman named Long Nails, Dijanaka, comes to him and announces that he doesn't approve of anything. This would have been a perfect time for the Buddha, if he had wanted, to chime in with the truth that life is suffering. Instead, he attacks the whole notion of taking a stand on whether life is worthy of approval. There are 3 possible answers to this question, he says. 1. Nothing is worthy of approval. 2. Everything is. And 3. Some things are and some things aren't. If you take any of these 3 positions, you end up arguing with the people who take either of the other 2 positions. And where does that get you? The Buddha then teaches Long Nails to look at his body and feelings as instances of the first noble truth. They're stressful, inconstant, and don't deserve to be clung to as self. Long Nails follows the Buddha's instructions, and, in letting go of his attachment to body and feelings, gains his first glimpse of the deathless, of what it's like to be totally free from suffering. The point of this story is that trying to answer God's question, passing judgment on the world, is a waste of time. And it offers a better use for the first noble truth. Looking at things, not in terms of world or life, but simply identifying suffering so that you can comprehend it, let it go, and attain release. Rather than asking us to make a blanket judgment, which, in effect, would be asking us to be blind partisans, the first noble truth asks us to look and see precisely where the problem of suffering lies. Other discourses show that the problem isn't with body and feelings in and of themselves. They themselves aren't suffering. The suffering lies in clinging to them. In his definition of the first noble truth, the Buddha summarizes all types of suffering under the phrase, the five aggregates of clinging. Clinging to physical form, including the body, feelings, perceptions, thought constructs, and consciousness. However, when the five aggregates are free from clinging, he tells us, they lead to long-term benefit and happiness. So, the first noble truth, simply put, is that clinging is suffering. It's because of clinging that physical pain becomes mental pain. It's because of clinging that aging, illness, and death cause mental distress. The paradox here is that in clinging to things, we don't trap them or get them under our control. Instead, we trap ourselves. When we realize our captivity, we naturally search for a way out. And this is where it's so important that the first noble truth not say that life is suffering. If life were suffering, where would we look for an end to suffering? We'd be left with nothing but death and annihilation. But when the actual truth is that clinging is suffering, we simply have to look for the clinging and eliminate its causes. This process takes time, though, because we can't simply tell the mind not to cling. It's like a disobedient child. If you force it to let go while you're looking, it'll search for a blind spot where you can't see it and will start to cling there. In fact, the mind's major blind spot, ignorance, is the prime cause that gives rise to clinging's proximate cause, craving. So, as the fourth noble truth, the Buddha recommends a path of practice to get rid of the blind spot. The path has 8 factors: right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. In a more abbreviated form, the Buddha's term for the practice is abandoning and developing. Abandoning activities that hinder awareness and developing qualities that expand its clarity and range. The abandoning, in which you refrain from unskillful thoughts, words, and deeds inspired by craving, is obviously an antidote to clinging. The developing, though, plays a more paradoxical role, for you have to hold to the skillful qualities of mindfulness, concentration, and discernment that foster awareness until they're fully mature. Only then can you let them go. It's like climbing a ladder to get on a roof. You grab hold of a higher rung so that you can let go of a lower rung, and then grab onto a rung still higher. As the rungs get further off the ground, your view gets more expansive, and you can see precisely where the mind's clingings are. You get a sharper sense of which parts of experience belong to which noble truth and what should be done with them. The parts that are suffering should be comprehended. The parts that cause suffering should be abandoned. The parts that form the path to the end of suffering should be further developed. And the parts that belong to the end of suffering should be verified. This helps you get higher and higher on the ladder until you find yourself securely on the roof. That's when you can finally let go of the ladder and be totally free. So the real question we face is not God's question, passing judgment on how skillfully He created life or the world. It's our question. How skillfully are we handling the raw stuff of life? Are we clinging in ways that serve only to continue the round of suffering, or are we learning to hold to the ladder-like qualities that will eliminate craving and ignorance so that we can grow up and not have to cling? If we negotiate life armed with all 4 noble truths, realizing that life contains both suffering and an end to suffering, there's hope. Hope that we'll be able to sort out which parts of life belong to which truth. Hope that someday, in this life, we'll discover the brightness at the point where we can agree with the Buddha, oh, yes, this is the end of suffering and stress. Why does life seem so full of suffering? When the Buddha formulated his first noble truth, the truth of suffering and stress, he didn't say something useless like, life is suffering, or obvious like, there is suffering. Instead, he said something much more useful, insightful, and to the point. Suffering is the 5 clinging aggregates. And as he explained elsewhere, the problem isn't the aggregates of form, feeling, perception, thought fabrications, and consciousness, it's the clinging. So when he said that all he taught was suffering and the end of suffering, he was really saying that all he taught was clinging and the end of clinging. If we want to understand his teachings and get the most out of them, we have to comprehend what clinging is, why it's suffering, and how he recommended bringing it to an end. Clinging. Clinging is something we do. This means that suffering is something we do. It's an active, rather than a passive, verb. It's also something with which we identify strongly. Our sense of self is composed of aggregates, which are also things we do, and identifying with that sense of self is one of the major forms of clinging. At the same time, the Pali word for clinging, Upadana, has a second meaning, to feed. The first noble truth is saying that we suffer from our feeding habits. So it's no wonder that many people resist the Buddha's analysis of suffering. It's as if he's placing the blame for their suffering on them and denying their right to find sustenance from the world. They'd rather hear that the world is making them suffer. They'd prefer a noble truth that let them continue feeding as they like and place the blame for their suffering outside. But the Buddha wasn't focused on placing blame. Instead, he was interested in empowerment. If you had to wait or fight for outside conditions to be just right in order for you to stop suffering, the end of suffering would be forever beyond reach. But because suffering is something you do, you can change what you do and stop suffering. With empowerment comes responsibility. If you're suffering from your feeding habits, it's up to you to find a new way to feed, one that strengthens you to the point where you have no more hunger of any kind. That's a tall order. As the Buddha's analysis shows, we suffer precisely because of our strongest attachments. The end of suffering requires that we sacrifice many of the things to which we're most firmly attached. Not only things that we identify as ours, but also many things we identify as us. But then, that's why this truth of suffering is a noble truth. Suffering itself isn't noble, but when you realize that you suffer because you cling, and you're willing to use the Buddha's analysis to rise above your clingings, it's a noble act. So this noble truth carries a noble duty. Instead of trying to run away from suffering, you have to comprehend it as clinging. Full comprehension means that you contemplate your clingings to the point of ending all passion, aversion, and delusion around them. And because clinging itself is a form of desire and passion, once clinging is fully comprehended, it ends. A first step in comprehending clinging is to identify the forms it takes. The Buddha lists 4. Sensuality clinging, passion and desire to find pleasure in fantasizing and planning sensual pleasures. View clinging, passion and desire for views about how the world is structured and how it works. Habit and practice clinging, passion and desire for ideas that tell you how you should act in the world. Doctrine of self-clinging, passion and desire for ways of defining who or what you are. This list may sound arbitrary and abstract until you realize that the Buddha is talking about some very basic functions of the mind. Sensuality clinging is all about what you want in terms of sensuality. View clinging is all about your ideas about what the world is and how it works. Habit and practice clinging covers your ideas of how you have to act in the world to get what you want. It's all about your ideas of what you should do. And doctrine of self-clinging is all about your sense of yourself as an agent, negotiating the way the world works and doing what needs to be done to find pleasure to feed. 2. The consumer who will enjoy those pleasures once they're attained. These two functions of the self are your basic set of strategies for finding happiness. The first three types of clinging define the arena in which your self acts and searches for happiness. The balance of power among the three will vary from person to person, and, even within a particular person, from moment to moment. If you want to reject all constraints on trying to fulfill your sensual fantasies, you might be inclined to accept a materialist, deterministic worldview where sensual pursuits are not subject to moral judgments and where the shoulds of the world counsel the pursuit of pleasure wherever you find it. This would be a case of sensuality clinging dictating your view of the world. If you want to believe that your dignity as a human being lies in your ability to choose your actions, you'll be inclined to adopt a non-deterministic worldview where choice is real. This would be a case where habit and practice clinging dictates your view of the world and what your attitude towards sensuality should be. And of course, there are not a few cases where people change their worldview to fit in with their desires of the moment. There are also cases where their wants run up against the shoulds and what is of a worldview to which they're committed for other reasons. Modern psychology has detailed the suffering that comes from precisely this sort of conflict, one that's not limited only to those suffering from severe mental illness. It's a common feature of the human condition. However, even though the first three types of clinging define the arena in which the self functions, the Buddha identified doctrine of self-clinging as the most basic type of clinging of all. As he stated, only in a teaching where this type of clinging is comprehended can people reach awakening. That's because your sense of who you are explains why you're invested in seeing the world a certain way and in believing that certain things should be done in order to attain what you want. Without your desire to gain pleasure for yourself, views of the world or of how you should act wouldn't have much hold on the mind. This may be why, of all the different forms of clinging, this is the one where the Buddha focused the most attention on explaining how clinging gets fixated on the five aggregates. According to him, you can identify the self either as identical with any of the aggregates, as possessing any of the aggregates, as containing any of the aggregates, or as existing within any of the aggregates. These four possibilities multiplied by 5 aggregates give 20 possible self-identity views to which you might cling, SN 22.1. Aside from doctrine of self-clinging, there's only one other instance where the Buddha specifies the relationship between clinging and the aggregates, and that's right concentration, which functions on the path as an example of habit and practice clinging. He notes that any of the 4 jhanas that comprise right concentration are composed of the 5 aggregates, whereas any of the formless attainments based on the 4th jhana are composed of the 4 mental aggregates: feeling, perception, fabrication, and consciousness. When we come to the central role that right concentration plays on the path to the end of clinging, we'll see why the Buddha gives even this much attention to the issue. Otherwise, he leaves it up to his listeners to figure out how any particular type of clinging translates into clinging aggregates. So it's obvious that doctrine of self-clinging is the most important type of clinging to comprehend. Its centrality may explain why some schools of Buddhism pay little attention to the other forms of clinging and focus all their efforts on uprooting a sense of self. They're right on one point, which is that the 2 roles of the self explain why clinging is suffering. The self as consumer, even though it enjoys feeding, is constantly hungry. As the Buddha said, Even if it rained gold coins, that wouldn't be enough to satisfy one person's sensual desires. This means that the self as agent has to be constantly at work, negotiating among wants and shoulds, trying to gain a measure of control over the way things are, all in order to assuage the hunger of the consumer, with never a moment's rest. However, you can't uproot your sense of self without also uprooting your other forms of clinging as well. Given that the self is what negotiates the world and tries to figure out how to act to gain pleasure, its identity is strongly linked to its range of strategies and skills for finding what it wants. These, in turn, rely on how it sees what is and what should be done. You see this connection most clearly when you move into a different culture or when your own society undergoes radical change. The world is no longer what it used to be. The skills that used to get results come up empty-handed, and your very identity gets called into question. To survive, you have to construct a new self around new skills for negotiating the new arena in which you act. So, given that the roots of the self are entangled in its wants, its worldviews, and its ideas of what should be done, if you want to uproot your sense or senses of self, you also have to uproot the other three types of clinging: your attitude towards sensuality and your sense of how you should act, given your views on how the world works. The end of clinging. Because desire is the motive force for all conditioned things, the first order of business in putting an end to suffering is to see the end of clinging as a desirable goal. And because sensuality clinging plays no role on the path to the end of clinging, you have to see the pleasure of sensuality as an inferior goal and freedom from sensuality as potentially desirable. This goes against some firmly ingrained habits. After all, it was because of sensuality that we took birth here in the human realm. Even the Buddha himself said that when he realized he would have to abandon sensuality to progress on the path, his heart didn't leap up at the prospect. Only when he admitted the drawbacks of sensuality and saw renunciation as freedom and rest did he actually get to work on abandoning his fascination with sensuality. The way he did this is suggested by the way he taught other people to do it. There were many cases where he wanted to teach the Four Noble Truths to his listeners, but because they didn't yet see the rewards of renunciation, they wouldn't fully benefit from hearing those truths. So, unlike university professors who plunge their students into the Four Noble Truths on day 1 of Buddhism 101, he first prepared his listeners' minds with what he called a graduated talk, MN 56. First, he described the joys of giving, then the joys of being virtuous, and then the pleasurable rewards that come from both generosity and virtue in the sensual heavens, rewards that far outweigh the rewards in this life. Once his listeners were attracted to the idea that the best way to attain sensual bliss was through generosity and virtue, he turned the tables on them by pointing out the drawbacks even of heavenly sensual pleasures. As you enjoy those pleasures, you get addicted and heedless, abandoning the good practices that got you to heaven to begin with. It's as if samsara were a sick joke. You work hard, developing good qualities of mind to gain long-lasting sensual pleasures, but then the act of enjoying those pleasures has a corrosive effect on the good qualities that produce them. The mind deteriorates as it grows accustomed to having its wants all met. That deterioration eventually causes it to fall, and you're back where you started, if not worse. When this realization inspires a sense of dismay, you begin to appreciate the idea that the only true happiness would lie in getting out of this trap. That's when you're ready for the Four Noble Truths. Now notice what the Buddha is doing in the course of giving this talk. To pry you away from your attachment to sensuality, he's providing you with a way of viewing the world in which a certain course of action, renunciation of sensuality, is an obvious should because it leads to your long-term welfare and happiness, with you defined in terms of multiple lifetimes. In other words, he's recommending new objects of view clinging and doctrine of self-clinging that will help get you started on the habits and practices of the path. As the talk explains, we live in a world where good actions are rewarded, both in this lifetime and in future ones. We ourselves are beings who will survive death, as we have already survived death many times, to enjoy the results of our actions. The talk itself explains the rewards and limitations of our actions in leading to sensual pleasure now and into the distant future, while the Four Noble Truths explain a path of action that leads away from the incessant round of lifetimes of sensual pleasure alternating with pain and toward a happiness totally unconditioned. The Noble Truths also propose an interim pleasure, the pleasure, rapture, and equanimity of right concentration, the last factor in the Fourth Noble Truth, that will form an alternative object of desire to replace your desires for sensuality. This non-sensual pleasure will be your food along the way, so that you're not tempted to go back to sensuality even as you understand its drawbacks. MN 14. In effect, he's offering a skillful type of habit and practice, clinging to replace sensuality clinging as your source of inner food. This means that the path to the end of clinging uses interim versions of three kinds of clinging: view clinging, habit and practice clinging, and doctrine of self-clinging. You hold on to the raft composed of these three forms of clinging until you get to the further shore. Only then do you let them go. Of the three, habit and practice clinging is the most pivotal. After all, the path to the end of clinging is a path of action, what the Buddha called the Kamma that puts an end to Kamma, which is why his teachings go into great detail on the habits and practices of virtue, concentration, and discernment that should be developed to form the path. However, to believe that such a path could actually work, you need a view about the world in which actions can be freely chosen and have the power to transcend the round of death and rebirth. This is why right views about karma and rebirth also form part of the path. At the same time, you need to have a sense that you, as an agent, are capable of following the path, and that you, as a consumer, will benefit from doing so. This is why, as part of his strategy for motivating you to engage in the path factor of right effort, the Buddha provided many teachings to encourage a healthy sense of self, saying that the self is its own mainstay, that it's responsible for its actions, that it's capable of mastering the path, and that it will benefit from doing so. But it's worth noting that even though the early teachings are very detailed in their instructions as to what should and shouldn't be done, the worldviews and self-views they provide in support of these instructions are only sketches. Many issues were at play in the worldviews actively discussed during the Buddha's time, but he focused only on views related to the nature of action, its powers, and the patterns of causality by which it brings about results. Karma and rebirth, for instance, were hotly debated by his contemporaries, so he had to take a position on those issues to justify the path of practice he taught. The size and age of the cosmos were also hot topics, but because they had no bearing on the power of action, the Buddha put those topics aside. Similarly, with issues of the self, other philosophical schools debated the question of how best to define the self, but the Buddha noted that to define yourself was to limit yourself, so he refused to answer questions about what the self was, or even whether it existed. As he said, questions of that sort weren't worthy of attention. MN 2. All he was concerned about was your perception of self, responsible for your actions, competent to follow the path, and able to benefit from doing so. That's all. This means that attempts in later centuries to turn the Buddha's sketches of a worldview and a self-view into complete maps of a cosmos and detailed diagrams of what you are were beside the point. It also means that modern-day demands that Buddhist teachings be fit into modern or postmodern ideas of how the world works and what a person is are also misguided. The Buddha meant for his world sketches and self-sketches to be precise and uncluttered, pared down to the absolute essentials. They stuck to the basics needed for practice and provided no more handles for clinging than were needed for holding on to the raft. In fact, the question of action was so central to the path to the end of clinging that one of the crucial steps in the path was to learn how to see how your sense of the world and yourself were nothing more than actions themselves. They come about from things you do. One of the most basic ways in which the Buddha introduced this lesson concerned 3 reflections he recommended for motivating you to stick with the practice at times when you're feeling discouraged, your mind is overcome by unskillful thoughts, and you're tempted to give up. The first reflection he called the self as a governing principle, the second, the world as a governing principle, and the third, the Dhamma as a governing principle, AN 340. To take the self as a governing principle is to remind yourself that you took on the practice because you were beset by aging, illness, and death, and you wanted to find an end to this mass of suffering and stress. The implication here is that you loved yourself when you started practicing. Do you not love yourself now? As you reflect in this way, you feel motivated to get back on the path. This reflection helps you to see how your sense of self changes and how you have the power to choose which sense of self you want to identify with. The self that loves itself, or the self that wants to give up on the possibility of putting an end to suffering. The choice is yours. Similarly with the world as a governing principle, you remind yourself that there are beings in the world who can read minds. What if they're reading your mind now? What will they think? As you reflect in this way, you rededicate yourself to making an effort in the practice. Here again, the Buddha is asking you to change your view of the world from one in which unskillful thoughts make sense to one in which unskillful thoughts are an embarrassment and in which there are beings who are concerned for your welfare. Reflecting on this, you see that your view of the world is the result of your own actions, and you can choose to focus on aspects of the world that encourage you to straighten out your mind and stick with the path. To take the Dhamma as a governing principle is to reflect on the excellence of the Dhamma and the fact that there are those who, through the practice of the Dhamma, are directly experiencing the Dhamma of the goal. How can you let yourself be lazy and heedless when this opportunity is at hand? Here again, as you think in this way, you feel motivated to get back to the practice that leads to that Dhamma. Of these 3 reflections, the Dhamma as a governing principle is central. It's because of the excellence of the Dhamma that the other 2 reflections make sense and can actually motivate you to practice. The excellence of the Dhamma is what makes you want it, and your desire for that excellence is the reason why sticking with the practice is a way of showing love for your best intentioned self. It's also why the concern of other beings for you to stick with the practice is a concern that should be honored. Now, all of these reflections are related to the 3 types of clinging used on the path. Self as a governing principle is obviously related to doctrine of self-clinging. World as a governing principle is related to view clinging. The relationship between the Dhamma as a governing principle to habit and practice clinging is not quite so obvious, but it's there. The Dhamma referred to in the reflection is the Dhamma of awakening, but the purpose of the reflection is the same as that of the other reflections: to get you to do what needs to be done, to develop the habits and practices of the path that will take you to that excellent Dhamma. This is just one of the ways in which views of the world and the self are shown to be actions, and in which habit and practice clinging acts as the central form of clinging used on the path. Another example of how the Buddha has you use clinging on the path is related to his 5-step program for dealing with unskillful thoughts that will pull you away from the practice. When a sensual desire or a wrong view about action threatens to pull you out of concentration, he recommends that you look at the thought in question as an action, a type of clinging, and then follow 4 steps. Observing: 1. The origination of the clinging, what causes it to arise. 2. Its falling away. 3. Its allure. And 4. Its drawbacks. When you see that the allure is far outweighed by the drawbacks, you develop dispassion for it, which is step 5. Escape. The crucial step here is to develop an acute sensitivity to the drawbacks. This is where the Buddha recommends analyzing the thought in question as an action and applying 3 perceptions to it. It's inconstant and stressful, so why perceive it as you or belonging to you? You should actually perceive it as not self. What's interesting here is that the motivation for applying this last perception is that you will benefit from it. In the passages where the Buddha has you reflect on the rewards of applying the perception of not self, even toward the last stages of the practice, the reflections are phrased in terms of I and mine. My making will be stopped. I'll be endowed with uncommon knowledge. And 6.104, or when he told the monks to abandon attachment to what was not theirs, he phrased the motivation as, whatever's not yours, let go of it. Your letting go of it will be for your long-term happiness and benefit. SN 35.101. So in these cases, even with the perception of not self, the Buddha is using a sense of you as motivation to keep you focused on following the habits and practices of the path. Of course, given that all clinging is suffering, even skillful forms of clinging ultimately have to be transcended if we want suffering to end. To do that, we have to develop a level of right view that, once the path is fully developed, allows us to abandon the path as well. Here again, the Buddha recommends taking his 5-step program and applying it to the skillful qualities developed on advanced stages of the path. He lays out the steps in several ways, but 2 are worthy of note. The first starts by focusing directly on habit and practice clinging. He has you apply the perceptions of drawbacks to the practice of concentration and discernment themselves. And 936 shows how this is done. First, you analyze your state of concentration into the 5 aggregates that comprise it. Then you apply the 3 perceptions or variations of them to those aggregates. As you develop dispassion even for the subtle pleasure and equanimity of concentration on the grounds that they're fabricated, you incline the mind to the unfabricated. Then, as fabrications fall away and you discern the deathless, you have to be careful not to cling even to that act of discernment. As you develop dispassion for it, your dispassion becomes all around. There's nothing left to cling to, and you can reach total unbinding. The second approach starts by focusing on view clinging, but quickly changes focus to habit and practice clinging as well. The Buddha recommends viewing the world as nothing more than the 6 senses, the 5 physical senses plus the mind, and the activities based on them. Then he has you see the 6 senses and their objects as old karma, and everything you do based on them as new karma, SN 35.1145. This is where the focus shifts to habits and practices. To develop dispassion for both types of karma, he recommends observing the world so defined as simply originating and passing away. When you focus on these things originating from moment to moment, the concept of non-existence with regard to the world doesn't occur to you. When you focus on their passing away, the concept of existence with regard to the world doesn't occur to you. This means that there's nothing left to cling to in terms of the world, SN 1215. At the same time, all you see is stress arising and stress passing away. You realize that no matter where you focus your attention, there's going to be nothing but stress. This induces a sense of dispassion for all action. You can't go anywhere else, and you can't stay where you are without entailing more stress. The Buddha described this paradoxical moment with a simile. It's like crossing a river without moving forward or staying in place. SN11. The constraints of space fall away, and there's nothing you can do. There's nothing left to cling to in terms of habits and practices. When there's no world in which to function, and nothing left to choose in terms of actions, the sense of self loses its reason for being. There's nothing to control, nothing to negotiate, and so it falls away too. This is how the deepest form of clinging gets abandoned, and that's when there's an opening to absolute release, totally hunger-free. It's in this way that our feeding habits come to an end, not because we force ourselves not to eat, but because we've found a state where there's no need to feed. Our situation as we ordinarily go through life is like being trapped in a bird cage. As long as we cling to the bars of the cage, we can't get out. But one wall of the cage contains a door. If you hold on to the bars of the door, the types of clinging used on the path, then when the door swings open, you're out of the cage, you're free. And as the Buddha said, from that point on, like birds flying through space, you leave no trace. Attacking suffering at its cause. The Buddha compared himself to a doctor, treating the mental sufferings and stresses, the dukkha, of living beings. Buddhist traditions over the centuries have expanded on this simile, noting that the Buddha's teachings are like medicine. In particular, many have noted that his most central teaching, the Four Noble Truths, is like a doctor's approach to curing an illness. The first noble truth, the truth of suffering, identifies the symptoms of the illness. The basic definition of the truth lists many things associated with suffering, such as birth, aging, and death, and then points out the common symptom in all forms of suffering that weigh on the mind, clinging to any of 5 activities called khandhas, or aggregates of physical form, feelings, perceptions, thought fabrications, and sensory consciousness. The second noble truth, the truth of the origination of suffering, pinpoints the cause of the illness. Any of 3 types of craving that lead to becoming: craving for sensuality, craving for becoming, and craving for non-becoming. The third noble truth, the truth of the cessation of suffering, states that the illness can be brought to an end by doing away with the cause. To be specific, the 3 types of craving come to an end when you develop dispassion for them and abandon them. That's how the symptoms of suffering can cease. The fourth noble truth, the truth of the path of practice leading to the end of suffering, prescribes the course of treatment that cures the illness. This treatment is the Noble Eightfold Path: right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The Buddha's explanation of the cessation of suffering in the third noble truth, noting that suffering has to be ended by attacking its cause, is where his approach most closely parallels that of a good doctor who treats an illness by treating the underlying cause rather than just the symptoms. In fact, this point is key to understanding the guidance offered by the Four Noble Truths. It highlights where the work has to be done if it's going to be effective. Yet there's no single place in the Pali Canon, the earliest extant record of his teachings, where the Buddha lays out a full depiction of exactly how the fourth truth, the Noble Eightfold Path, targets the second, the 3 types of craving. Still, there are fragments of an explanation scattered throughout the discourses of the canon. By pulling those fragments together, we can gain a coherent picture of how the Buddha's course of treatment works and why it's well suited to attack the disease of suffering right at its root. To focus on the cause. The first step in understanding how and why the path works is to look at the cause of suffering in detail. Beginning with the broadest terms, the Buddha states that suffering comes from within the mind itself, and in particular is caused by desire, SN 42:11. He admits that there are many phenomena existing outside that can cause pain through the six senses, the five physical senses plus the intellect as the sixth, but he observes that these things cause mental suffering only if they affect things for which the mind feels desire. Now, as the Buddha states elsewhere, all phenomena, events, objects, actions, known through the senses are rooted in desire, and 1058. This presents two challenges, the first of many that emerge as we unpack the cause of suffering. The first challenge is that if we try to abandon all desire in the quest to put an end to suffering, it stands to reason that we'll also end up putting an end to the experience of all sensory phenomena. That may sound bad, but it's not. The Buddha notes that unbinding, nibbana, nirvana, the freeing of the mind from all suffering, is the end of all phenomena in 1058. But it's not a blanking out. Instead, he describes it as a kind of consciousness, outside of space and time, known independently of the senses, DN 11, MN 49, and as the highest happiness, DHP 203. Still, there were many people in his time, as there are now, who have trouble imagining such a happiness, and a large part of the Buddha's challenge as a teacher was to help his listeners expand their own imaginations to encompass such a happiness as a desirable possibility, and, in fact, the only genuine form of health, MN 75. The second challenge is more strategic. If there is a path of action leading to the end of suffering, it too is composed of phenomena, so it too has to be rooted in desire. To put an end to all suffering, we will have to employ certain desires to put an end to others, but then we'll have to abandon those path desires when they've done their work, SN 51:15. Meanwhile, because the path is rooted in desire, there will also have to be some suffering or stress involved in following the path, in the same way that some beneficial medical treatments involve pain. To go totally beyond stress, the ultimate act of discernment will have to sense the subtle stress of the path factors and foster dispassion for them, AN 936. The cure is complete when there is no more stress, either from the original disease or from its treatment. As a first step in this strategy, the Buddha divides desire into two sorts. On the one hand, there are the desires he identifies as part of the path. Basically, the desire to abandon unskillful mental qualities and to develop skillful ones in their place. On the other hand, there are the desires he identifies as the cause, or, in his terms, the origination, samudaya, of suffering. These are the three types of craving mentioned above: craving for sensuality, craving for becoming, and craving for non-becoming. Craving for sensuality, the Buddha says, is aimed less at sensual pleasures themselves and more at the mind's fascination with thinking about and planning them, AN 6:63. A large part of sensual pleasure lies in the fantasies we use to embroider it. Craving for becoming. Becoming, bhava, is the act of taking on an identity in a particular world of experience. The world here can be either an interior thought world or any of the outside worlds into which beings are born to pursue their desires. These becomings can exist on any one of three levels: the level of sensuality, the level of form, and the level of formlessness, AN 377. A becoming on the level of sensuality, for instance, would include the pleasures or pains of the five physical senses. A becoming on the level of form would include the experience of the form of the body as felt from within. A becoming on the formless level would include such formless dimensions as infinite space or infinite consciousness. In the Buddha's analysis, becomings involving outside worlds come from becomings within the mind. In every case, they begin with desire, for a certain pleasure, for example, or to take on a particular role in a world. A sense of the world then coalesces around the object of that desire. This world will include everything relevant to attaining the desire, plus anything that might get in its way. At the same time, a threefold sense of self develops around the desire as well. The self as the producer, who will or won't be able to attain the desired object or role. The self as the consumer, who hopes to enjoy the fulfillment of the desire. And the self as commentator, who self-reflectively evaluates and comments on the actions of the other two, AN 340, AN 4159. For instance, if you want some ice cream, the relevant world would include the nearest place where ice cream can be found, plus anything that would allow you to get there and obtain the ice cream. Your sense of self as the producer in that particular becoming would include your body, as either capable or incapable of getting the ice cream. If you can make ice cream, that skill would be relevant to that particular sense of self too. If you have to buy the ice cream, the amount of money in your pocket or your bank account would be more relevant. Your sense of self as the consumer, of course, is the you who hopes to enjoy the ice cream once it's obtained, while your sense of self as commentator judges whether the other two do their job to your satisfaction. The mind goes through many of these becomings in the course of a day, often with a different sense of the world and sense of self in each case. This is why your sense of self and of the world can change so quickly. Craving for non-becoming is the desire to see a particular becoming come to an end. This type of craving can be motivated by any number of reasons. For example, in some cases, you might want to see a becoming end because the root desire that generated it has been thwarted, as when you fall in love with someone who calls off the relationship to marry someone else. In other cases, it's because your sense of the world or of yourself in that becoming has involved some unanticipated suffering, as when you marry the person you love, but the marriage turns out to be a disaster. Or it may be because another becoming has arisen in the mind around a desire that conflicts with the first becoming, as when you're stuck in a bad marriage and fall in love with someone else. In all cases, the craving for non-becoming finds delight in its desire to escape from the becoming in which you find yourself. When the Buddha introduces these three forms of craving, he points out that they have one feature in common. They all lead to becoming, SN 5611. What he doesn't point out at first, but what he does indicate in other parts of the canon, is that each presents strategic challenges if you want to abandon it. The challenge posed by craving for sensuality lies in the fact that we ordinarily see sensual pleasure as our only alternative to pain, SN 36:6. This means that any effort to abandon sensuality will require a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, we have to learn how to see the drawbacks of sensuality. On the other, we need to provide the mind with an alternative, non-sensual pleasure with which to nourish itself. Otherwise, as the Buddha notes, even when you see the drawbacks of sensuality, if you don't have access to a higher form of pleasure, the mind will go back to its original craving for sensuality, or to one that's even worse, MN 14. At the same time, because craving for sensuality leads to becoming, it actually entails craving for becoming. This means that you can't abandon it without attacking craving for becoming at the same time. The challenge posed by craving for becoming lies in the fact that we use our various senses of self and of the world as tools for finding happiness, so we have difficulty imagining how we could achieve anything desirable without them. To pursue a path of practice that will end this type of becoming, you have to see that you'll benefit from taking it on. This point may seem paradoxical. After all, when there's no more becoming, there will be no sense of you. But strategically, it's necessary. People accustomed to thinking in the terms that constitute becoming have to be given reasons that make sense within those terms before they'll adopt any path of practice. As long as you're still attached to your sense of self, you want to know that you'll benefit from following the path. However, the fact that craving for non-becoming also leads to becoming, MN 49, presents a further strategic challenge, one that's particularly tricky. Even though the Buddha encourages you to end craving for becoming, you can't simply replace it with craving for non-becoming. If you do, you'll cling to the desire to end becoming, and that act of clinging will lead to more becoming. The way out of this dilemma is to look at the processes leading up to becoming as events in and of themselves, and to develop dispassion for them before any sense of self or world develops around them. The Buddha calls this approach seeing what has come to be, Bhuta, as what has come to be, Iti 49. In SN 1231, he corroborates Ven. Sariputta's explanation of what this means. You see what has come to be as having come from a cause. If you develop dispassion for the cause will cease, and whatever has come into being based on that cause will cease as well. In practice, this means that you can't focus directly on becoming, and you can't even think in terms of self or world. Instead, you have to focus on the process of events that would lead up to those concepts, simply as events in a causal chain, with no thought of where they're happening or who they're happening to. They're just events as events. As these causes for new becomings disband through dispassion, no new becomings can form. At the same time, any becomings already existing will be allowed to cease. This is the only way in which becoming can be totally brought to an end. So any path that will lead to the end of becoming has to focus on discerning chains of events in the mind before those events can coalesce into becomings, and at the same time inducing dispassion for them. The question is, how do the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path address the challenges presented by these three forms of craving? Dealing with sensuality. They tackle craving for sensuality first, explaining the drawbacks of sensuality and providing an alternative pleasure to pry the mind away from its obsession with sensual pleasure. Right view is the primary factor focusing on the drawbacks. It's important to note that right view operates on three progressive levels: mundane, transcendent, and beyond transcendent, and that mundane right view plays the leading role in bringing to light the drawbacks of sensuality. It does this by focusing on the role of karma, intentional action, in determining how beings fare in the various worlds existing in the universe. Actions based on unskillful intentions lead to suffering and unfortunate rebirths in unpleasant worlds. Actions based on skillful intentions to happiness and fortunate rebirths in pleasant worlds. The Pali discourses explain how, in the context of kama, craving for sensuality often leads to unskillful mental states, and so to unskillful behavior, MN 13, MN 54. These unskillful states include not only greed and lust, but also ill will and cruelty when your desires are thwarted. The behavior engendered by these states leads to suffering either in this lifetime, in lives to come, or in both. For example, craving for sensuality leads to quarrels and wars, which are painful both in and of themselves and in their long-term consequences. Even when sensual desires lead to skillful behavior, as when you practice generosity or observe the precepts in order to enjoy the results of those actions in the sensual heavens, those heavenly sensual pleasures will end before you've had your fill of them. In the vast majority of cases, when they end, you will have exhausted your good karma and will fall to the pains of the lower realms. SN 56, 102, 113. This is why the canon prescribes so many contemplations focused on the drawbacks of sensual objects, the human body in particular, MN 10, AN 1060. These contemplations help you see that the pleasures offered by these objects are minuscule when compared to the harm that comes from allowing yourself to develop craving for them. The The path factor, providing the second prong of the attack on craving for sensuality, a non-sensual alternative pleasure to sensuality, is right concentration. This factor consists of 4 levels of absorption, jhana, that can be accessed when the mind puts aside sensual thoughts and other unskillful mental qualities, and centers on an object it finds pleasurable, SN 45:8. The object for concentration most often mentioned in the discourses is the breath. When centered on the breath, the mind trains itself to be aware of the entire form of the body as felt from within, and directs the breath in a way that allows a sense of pleasure and rapture to suffuse the body to the point of saturation. That's the first jhana. The remaining jhanas grow more refined until, with the fourth, the breath becomes very still, the mind equanimous, mindful, and alert, and a bright awareness fills the body as a whole. MN 118, MN 119. For the mind to enter these states of absorption in a solid and reliable way requires several preliminary steps. This is where the remaining factors of the path come in. To begin with, right concentration requires a foundation of mental well-being and calm that comes from knowing that you haven't behaved in unskillful ways that would be reason for regret or shame. So based on the understanding provided by right view, right resolve focuses on making a firm resolution not to give rise to unskillful mental states such as sensuality, ill will, or harmfulness. The path factors related to virtue, right speech, right action, and right livelihood build on that resolution by exercising restraint over your actions so that you don't intentionally speak in unskillful ways, lying, speaking divisively, speaking harshly, or engaging in idle chatter. You don't intentionally act in unskillful ways, killing, stealing, or engaging in illicit sex. And you don't intentionally engage in forms of livelihood that would harm yourself or others. The blamelessness that comes from following these path factors induces a sense of joy conducive to concentration. As you follow these factors skillfully, you also develop some of the mental skills required for making concentration right. To begin with, in highlighting the issue of intention, these factors turn your attention inside so that you become more observant of the mind. At the same time, they require that you be mindful in the Buddha's original sense of the word, which is to keep something in mind. Here you keep in mind the principles of virtue. At the same time, you have to be alert to what you're doing, to make sure that your actions stay within the bounds of those principles. These two qualities, mindfulness and alertness, are basic to the practice of right concentration. Building on the joy developed by the path factors related to virtue, the next factor, right effort, brings the mind into concentration by turning your attention fully inside. Its purpose is to take the general principles of right resolve, to avoid unskillful mental states, and to apply them to individual events arising and passing away in the mind. An important part of right effort is to generate desire to do this, so that you aren't simply forcing the mind into a mold, but are actively getting it to see the value of taking on this training. This induces a sense of rapture and joy conducive to concentration. The practice of right concentration proper begins with the establishings of right mindfulness, which the discourses call the themes of concentration, MN 44. The formula for right mindfulness states that you remain focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. The formula is then repeated for 3 other frames of reference: feelings in and of themselves, mind states in and of themselves, and mental qualities in and of themselves. The focus in every case is on events as they are directly experienced, devoid of any reference to the world outside. This is a first step in getting the mind to observe events as they have come to be, before they are viewed in reference to any level of becoming involving the outside world. However, The instructions for right mindfulness still make reference to I and me. I will train myself to breath insensitive to the whole body. Mindfulness as a factor of awakening has arisen within me, MN 10. This shows that the instructions still assume a subtle level of becoming in the world inside the body and mind. When mindfulness is firmly established, it gets the mind into the first jhana, MN 125, and so connects directly with right concentration. Although the standard description of the path lists, under the heading of right concentration, only the 4 jhanas, which are on the level of form, other descriptions of right concentration include 4 additional formless states that are based on the equanimity of the 4th jhana, MN 140, MN 52. The Buddha's strategy here is obvious. He's redirecting your desires, getting you to practice craving substitution by cultivating cravings for becoming on the levels of form and formlessness as alternatives to craving for becoming on the level of sensuality. The subtle but pervasive pleasures to be found in these states of concentration make it easier for the mind to lose interest in sensual pleasures and fantasies. However, they're not enough to bring craving for sensuality to a halt. If your practice were to stop here, then after death you might be headed, at best, to one of the heavens on the level of form or formlessness, only to fall from that heaven when your concentration began to unravel. The canon contains stories of devas on these levels returning to the sensual levels out of sheer wantonness, DN 1. That's because of the willful nature of craving for pleasure. As the Buddha notes, craving can focus now here, now there, SN 5611, depending on whatever happens to strike your fancy. It's also because craving for sensuality includes within it the terms of becoming, a sense of you obtaining or experiencing a pleasure in a particular world of experience. If you don't develop at least some dispassion toward the terms of becoming, you won't be able to get past sensuality. This point is illustrated in a famous scene in the canon where a libertine tries to seduce a nun, Fig 14. He makes only veiled allusions to the pleasures of sex, and instead dwells on the type of person she will become, and the world in which she will live if she agrees to his proposition. Like a doll made of gold you will go about, like a goddess in the gardens of heaven, dwelling in the calm of a palace. Have women wait on you. I will make you many and varied ornaments, of gold, jewels, and pearls. Climb onto a costly bed, scented with sandalwood carvings, with a well-washed coverlet, beautiful, spread with a woolen quilt, brand new. She doesn't fall for his words, but the fact that the terms of becoming are integral to his sensual fantasy, and the fact that this is a common feature of all such fantasies, underscores an important point. Sensuality is firmly embedded in becoming. So the only way to completely end any of the 3 forms of craving is to focus on the limitations of becoming itself, regardless of its level. For that, the Buddha prescribes the stronger medicine of transcendent right view. Dealing with becoming and non-becoming. Transcendent right view looks at experience in terms of the 4 noble truths and the duties appropriate to each truth. Suffering is to be comprehended, its origination abandoned, its cessation realized, and the path leading to its cessation developed. This level of right view functions in 2 ways. First, it points out the drawbacks of all types of becoming in that they are based on clinging, and clinging is identical with suffering, SN 5611. In doing so, it contrasts these drawbacks with the happiness to be found when clinging is abandoned. Second, in inducing dispassion for becoming, right view has to avoid the danger of giving rise to craving for non-becoming and the states of becoming that would follow inevitably on that type of craving. The 4 noble truths and their expanded explanation, dependent co-arising, accomplish both tasks by focusing on the causal chain of events leading up to becoming, SN 12.2. unlike mundane right view, which speaks in terms appropriate to becoming, of beings acting in ways that lead to their taking on identities in pleasant or unpleasant worlds, the Four Noble Truths dispense with those terms entirely. Instead, they speak simply of actions and their results. These are terms appropriate for seeing the events leading up to becoming simply as events as they have come to be, in a causally originated series, before notions of self, beings, or world get applied to them. To comprehend, in line with the duty of the First Noble Truth, the events in these series that entail suffering, and to abandon, in line with the duty of the Second Noble Truth, any craving for the events leading up to them, you have to develop dispassion for all of them. The Buddha lays out a 5-step program for doing this, SN 22.5, SN 22 and 26, SN 35, 13 and 14. 1. See their origination. 2. Observe their passing away. These 2 steps allow you to discern their fabricated nature as steps in a process. 3. Look for their allure, why the mind is attracted to them. 4. Look for the drawbacks of clinging to them. When you see that the drawbacks far outweigh the allure, 5. Dispassion arises, providing the escape from them. The crucial step in this approach is the 4th. The Buddha prescribes many perceptions to apply to these fabricated events to help you see that they're not worth the effort of fabricating states of becoming around them. These perceptions fall into 3 main groups: focusing on the inconstancy of fabrications, focusing on the stress of whatever is inconstant, and focusing on the fact that if something is inconstant and stressful, it's not self. In other words, any state of becoming that you construct out of such raw materials won't lie under your control, and so inevitably will lead to disappointment. The effort required to construct a sense of self around such things is simply not worth it. Just as the terms of analysis get changed as you move from mundane to transcendent right view, so do the terms in 2 other path factors. Right resolve becomes focused directly on the fabrications that get the mind into right concentration, your internal conversation composed of acts of directed thought and evaluation, MN 117. Right mindfulness moves to a level called the development of the establishing of mindfulness, SN 4740, in which you're mindful to focus on the phenomenon of origination and passing away with regard to any of the 4 frames of reference, without trying to place them in a context defining where those events are happening or who is doing the analysis. In other words, you focus on events simply as events in a process, as they are caused and pass away, without trying to frame them in the terms of a becoming. Putting these 2 path factors together with transcendent right view means that the analysis of things as they have come to be is now focused on observing the practice of concentration itself. This is the best place to focus on craving for becoming, because of the various types of becoming, concentration is the most transparent, in that it allows you to clearly see the steps that go into its formation. It's the ideal state of mind for applying the Buddha's 5-step program to the aggregates, SN 22.5. First, you use that program to develop dispassion for any distractions that would pull you out of concentration. Then you apply the same program to states of concentration themselves, to see that even these refined becomings on the form and formless levels are made out of fabricated events, AN 936, MN 52. This means that they can never provide a happiness that's totally stable and secure. When this insight hits home, the mind realizes that it can't find security in the concentration it's experiencing, but neither can it fabricate an alternative that would provide that security either. As a result, it develops dispassion for all fabrications and all types of craving, and inclines to the deathlessness of what is unfabricated, the 3rd Noble Truth. At that point, if the mind drops all clinging, it gains total awakening. If, however, it develops a sense of passion around the discernment that brought about the experience of the deathless, it attains the penultimate level of awakening, called non-return. It drops once and for all any interest in craving for sensuality, but still clings to a subtle craving for becoming or non-becoming. This is where you have to use the third level of right view, beyond the transcendent, in which right view turns the terms of analysis on right view itself, enabling the mind to go beyond any attachment to views. In other words, you don't go beyond views by deciding to be agnostic. After all, that too would count as a view, DN1, SN 2281. And you don't go beyond views by being fluid in your views, for that would simply lead to inconsistent behavior and serial clinging. Instead, you go beyond views, including right view, by seeing them in terms of how they are formed as processes. This enables you to see how they're constructed from events as they have come to be, and realize that, no matter how right or true they may be, anything constructed in this way is worthy of dispassion, AN 1093. Because right view is the only view that allows for itself to be viewed in this way, it's the only view that can accomplish the work of putting an end to all craving, the desires listed in the second noble truth, along with those listed under the path itself. Things as they have come to be. The knowledge that forms the last step to awakening is, in some discourses, termed Yatha Bhutanyana Dasana, SN 5611. Because Bhuta can mean truth in addition to what has come to be, this compound is often translated as knowledge and vision of things as they truly are. However, when we see the way the term Bhuta is used in describing the strategy that reaches awakening by avoiding the twin pitfalls of craving for becoming and craving for non-becoming, a more accurate translation would seem to be knowledge and vision of things as they have come to be. This translation has the advantage of being strategically more precise, emphasizing that the knowledge in question is not simply a matter of viewing reality as a whole in a particular way, but more a way of focusing on mental processes in and of themselves as they are happening, so as to induce dispassion for them, and through dispassion, to gain release from them. The liberation that results is total. When every possible object of desire has been abandoned through dispassion, all phenomena, all activities around the six senses disband. Some passages describe unbinding as the ending of phenomena, AN 1058. Others as the point where they are done away with, SIN 5 is 6. All that remains is a consciousness without surface, DN 11, MN 49. Although, because it's outside of space and time, the word remains doesn't do it full justice. This experience of the unfabricated, the highest happiness, leaves nothing to be desired. This is how craving is ended, not because it has been suppressed, but because there's no longer any need for it. After the experience of awakening, arhants return to the six senses, but experience them disjoined from them, MN 140. Not in an alienated way, but simply with no need to feed on them. Arhants can still act, and can still desire that their actions lead to good results for beings of the world, but they no longer cling to their desires, so they no longer experience mental suffering. When life ends, their freedom has no constraints at all. This, in the Buddha's words, is the attainment of true health, MN 75, Dhamma medicine. This is how the Buddha's prescription of the Noble Eightfold Path deals effectively with the strategic challenges presented by the cravings that cause mental suffering. Rorimwe right view does the work of pinpointing the crucial symptom of suffering, identifying the underlying cause of the symptom, and then figuring out the strategies needed to develop the dispassion that puts an end to the cause. Without right view, you wouldn't know where to attack the problem of suffering. You wouldn't know the strategic challenges presented by craving and the processes of becoming. and you wouldn't know how to overcome them. Right effort generates the desire needed to follow through with the course of treatment indicated by right view. Right mindfulness and right concentration together provide the solid state of mind where the treatment can be accomplished. Without the pleasure of right concentration, you wouldn't be able to pull yourself away from sensual cravings long enough to follow the complete course of treatment. Without the stillness and alertness of right concentration, you wouldn't be able to see the factors that ordinarily lead to becoming as they have come to be. The four other path factors, right resolve, right speech, right action, and right livelihood, play supporting roles in allowing for right mindfulness and right concentration to be established in a reliable way. The Buddha's teachings are like a chest full of medicines. When we gain an overall view of how the Noble Eightfold Path works, we can see how it's uniquely suited as a course of treatment for using those medicines to attack suffering at its underlying cause. This gives us confidence that the path is well suited to curing the basic problem in our hearts and minds. At the same time, we learn which medicines to take and in what order, so that we can more quickly enjoy the absolute inner health for which the Buddha prescribed them.